Hello, folks. So I'm joined by Brent Langle, the playwright, political activist, writer. He's actually the author of a new comic that just came out, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse. I have a copy of it myself. He's got a copy of it there. Very exciting stuff. And we're actually going to have a conversation here about fantasy and science fiction and the political nature of these fictional genres, be they books, comic books, movies, cartoons, or whatnot. So I wanted to start out. Brent, you had raised a point that I had made during my debate with Augustus Sol Invictus, where I talked about fantasy versus science fiction. And I'm certainly not the first person to point out or claim that fantasy tends to have a right wing bent, whereas science fiction, by its very nature, has a left wing bent. Obviously, big exceptions to both of those rules. What do you make of that claim?
I think to a certain extent it's really valid. I mean, I'm like the biggest fantasy fan in the world. Like there's a gargoyle right behind me. I'm wearing a Viking torque, and I write fantasy. Like that's my favorite genre to work in. Snow White Zombie is like horror and action, but it is beyond all like a dark fantasy. And it's one of the things that like, what do I get to write when I really want to write whatever I want? Well, you get that. So I'm a huge fan of fantasy. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien is probably one of the bigger artistic influences on my life, and not just artistic, but like aesthetic influences. I have like a freaking Strider's Ranger sword from the movies, just like right off camera there. So.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm a giant nerd. It's all right.
Well, speaking of Tolkien, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, I know about Lord of the Rings, seen the movies, read the books. Many people have just not been able to find a political message there. Some people have tried to claim it's World War II, but then that's been debunked. And what politics do you see in Tolkien?
I think there's a ton of politics in Tolkien. And I think a lot of people, the fact that people can look at Tolkien and take so many different things from it is kind of a testament to his ability as a writer and his world building. I won't say that Tolkien's prose is the best because he was a linguist before he was a writer. And like it shows because, you'll be reading, if you read Lord of the Rings, like there's a lot of sections where it's like, Frodo went up the mountain, and then Frodo stared at a blade of grass, and Frodo went down the mountain. And then there was a huge, exciting fight scene somewhere else, and then Frodo looked at another blade of grass and took another step. I made fun of this actually in one of my plays, North to Maine. But like Tolkien's, there's a lot that you can find in there. His Catholicism heavily influenced a lot of it, and Catholicism has been it's been both radically left and radically right. So I think you can have multiple interpretations. You can see it as anti-industrial. There's even like a Marxist reading where they see like it is in Sauron is a Lenin bringing together the oppressed orcs and trolls, which doesn't really fit with his world building, but I can see that reading. Particularly when the racism works its way into his work, and you get like the fact that all the black people in Lord of the Rings are there are no like named characters that are black, and the only ones that are mentioned are in league with Sauron. They're like men from the East he has conscripted or who've come to work for him as mercenaries. So like it's not like
Franco in Spain, right? He conscripted a lot of and North African folks, right?
The Moors, yeah, and that was he had them fighting with the fascists, and the fascists used that to their advantage in a number of ways, which we can get into if you want to, because I've studied a lot about Spain, but yeah. So I mean, Tolkien's politics, I think ultimately, at least to me, and this may be me reading my own anarchist bias into it, but like I think Lord of the Rings is ultimately about a rejection of power and a rejection of total power, like tossing the ring into the volcano at the end. That is essentially the fact that you have somebody like Gandalf refusing to take the ring. Really shows that Tolkien, his biggest critique seems to be beyond like the religious stuff, seems to be against mankind rising above their station to a certain extent. And so I think ultimately like that's what Tolkien talks about. And his politics seem very grounded in like the world that he lived in, and like you look at his ideal society is essentially the Shire. Now there's problems with the Shire, there's jerks and stuff that you have to deal with, but it's that memory of home, that kind of petite bourgeoisie space that he really sees as like, I think, the ideal place to live, or at least the ideal place to live for his characters. And that's what causes them to maintain themselves and their own, I guess, to put it, to remain true to themselves and true to their souls in when they're tempted by the great power that the ring offers.
Well, that theme of the ring seems to fit a Catholic teaching. I actually didn't realize until this conversation that Tolkien was Catholic, but it kind of makes sense because the Catholic teaching on sin and vice, I guess, more than sin, but vice, right, is that it kind of consumes you, right, that you become kind of addicted, right? And that's kind of what you see with the ring in Lord of the Rings. Like, they're using it to become invisible, but gradually they kind of become consumed by it. Like, the sin overtakes the person. They think they're doing it for their own reasons, but pretty soon the sin overtakes the person. The other thing, though, that's interesting is, one of the main ideologues of the far right in Italy, who was a big influence on Italian fascism, was Julius Evola. And Evola was not a Catholic, actually. He was a pagan. And one of his main books is called Revolt Against the Modern World. And he spends the entire book going over ancient mythology, Hinduism, ancient Chinese mythology, and trying to look through mythology to find some kind of eternal truth. And that seems to be what a lot on the far right believe, that there is some kind of sacred way in which human beings operate. There's like the magic formula for human civilization where everything's perfect and everyone knows their place and there's no class struggle and there's no protests and it's just perfectly authoritarian. And that some of these fascist and far right thinkers, they find themselves going through like ancient mythology trying to find this eternal truth that they can then employ in the present time and get rid of the confusion and chaos. And so I can see why mythology and magic might have a role in somebody who's maybe a Catholic far rightist. I mean, is that kind of what you see in Tolkien?
I don't think he's far right. I think he would probably. What's interesting, actually, is one of the things that he said towards the end of his life was that more than anything, he was attracted to anarchism, and that that was where his politics had lent. That he began to feel that no human was worthy to wield great power, which, I mean, you can see that throughout Lord of the Rings, and then it became more clear to him. But I think Tolkien, I mean, he was kind of a stodgy British intellectual, so I think probably I could see him voting, Tory or voting Republican frequently. I like, a lot of, when I look at like politics sometimes, I look both at like the explicit policies that a person wants, and then also like who they are by nature. Like sometimes I'll say that like far right libertarianism, like anarcho-capitalism, Randian kind of objectivism stuff, like a lot of that stuff will snare people who would probably be left anarchists by temperament, but because they're not aware of left anarchism, they get sucked into it, and their temperament may go one way, but then their policies go another way because of like the tribe that they get adopted by. So you mentioned what was the name of the guy, the fascist?
Evola, Julius Evola.
Julius Evola. Yeah, that's one that I haven't looked into a lot, but also like you have people like Savitri Devi, who came in and is sort of the reason why Nazism has like such a it's the reason why like there are, for instance, environmentalist fascists, and also she kind of tried to fuse Nazism with Hinduism and her own like kind of crazy cat lady ideology. So yeah, I think there's, in a right-wing tendency, there is always a huge emphasis on nostalgia, particularly with like reactionaries, where they go back to some I guess, like forgotten or lost age. It's the desire to return to the womb, to return to the Garden of Eden, to return to the Shire, you know? So, you know, fantasy as a genre tends to look at the past and mythologize the human past, whereas sci-fi tends to look to the future. And you can often see that, like, usually a person who's more into science, or who's more into science fiction, tends to be more of a kind of classical type thinker. Like I find them to be like the people that are really into like Star Trek. They tend to like be a little more on the left. And then sometimes like
on from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Let me just add, when I first heard about the Church of Scientology and that it was started by a man by the name of L. Ron Hubbard, I heard people talking about it, and I assumed his name was L. Ron Hubbard. I assumed, based on having read Lord of the Rings. So that's my funny anecdote about that. But you mentioned science fiction. I think that's particularly interesting because there's a one of the early works of science fiction. I know, like the first work of science fiction, I guess the first piece of science fiction writing is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Am I correct about that?
I believe so.
I've always seen that as a left-wing political work. I mean, I see it as a critique of the Industrial Revolution, the idea being that, hey, we're doing these miraculous things with machines and we're making so much with electricity, but we have not cared for people and we've kind of lost our soul in the process. I've always seen it as left-wing, but the standard, formula dogmatic Marxist critique is, oh, this is anti-historical progress. It's saying don't play God. It's anti-science. I don't see it that way. What do you make of Mary Shelley? And talk more about science fiction.
I mean, Mary Shelley is one of the first like feminist writers. Like, I really think she is. Like, in fact, you can almost see Frankenstein as a parable for like what happens when men steal the power of creation from women. Like, because that's really what happens. And in fact, there's a line in the play version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein where Dr. Frankenstein is confronting his monster like in the towards the North Pole. And there's even like a line that's like, there's no mothers here. So yeah, I think Frankenstein, this is the other thing about art, because art is different from political propaganda in the sense that like, and I've always been kind of an artist first, and then I became an activist with Occupy because like I wasn't going to be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't try to do something, if that makes sense. So, but like art doesn't so much, it's not usually so much about telling you explicitly what we need to do. It's more about communicating with you on a human level, about sharing the truth about existence and about the human condition with your audience, and the truth about the world as you see it. So that's kind of what differentiates art from political propaganda and can make it a lot more powerful, especially when like it's done in a irresponsible or evil way. I mean, I will tell you, I think Ayn Rand probably is one of the foremost political influencers out of like everybody on the right. And the fact is the reason why she is that way is because she did it through art. Like, I don't think she's a particularly good writer, but her writing is very compelling, especially to people at certain points in their lives. And so, reading Atlas Shrugged can get somebody to go a certain way in a way that like reading a pamphlet about libertarianism simply can't. Art makes friends with you, essentially.
It seems to me that when I look at the Ayn Rand stuff, she's trying to write socialist realism for capitalism. That's kind of how I see it. Especially, you look at the art on the cover of the books, it makes it really explicit. Those look like Soviet statues. The way the text is written, she's trying to sound like Maxim Gorky or one of the Marxist novelists that was very popular in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. She's a Soviet exile herself and becomes a narc for the House Un-American Activities Committee. And she's writing novels that are attempts to speak the way Soviet propagandists do in reference to capitalism and in defense of capitalism. And she kind of hobbles together this ideology, objectivism, which is an attempt to present capitalism as revolutionary. It has a view of philosophy. She's basically trying to hobble together an anti-Marxism. Do you see Rand that way?
Oh yeah, I mean, Atlas Shrugged was originally titled The Strike, and one of the things that
and it's about a strike of all the rich men against the poor. So
yeah, exactly. It's just taking socialist rhetoric and inverting it. And, a lot of that I've seen, like, as political propaganda has gone on, a lot of it is taking the other team's symbol and inverting it. There's like back when I remember the anarcho-capitalists were trying to steal anarchist memes. There was like this whole meme war going back and forth. This was like 2013, 2014, where like an anarchist page would put out a socialist meme, and then the fake ANCAP page with the same name would steal that meme, change the colors, and try to make it apply to what they were talking about. And I think, that's something that people have done. It's a rhetorical trick that has worked and has been used, as long as we had symbols to do it. But I think Ayn Rand, in a lot of ways, she just took, socialist rhetoric and turned it on its head. Just like you said, she's trying to create an anti-socialism in favor of like capitalism and individualism. I don't know if she was 100% aware that that was what she was doing, because, again, like so much of the creative process is subconscious, and so much of being a successful artist is kind of connecting with that and writing instinctively, as opposed to writing prescriptively, if that makes sense. And like Rand is probably at her best when she's being instinctual and when she doesn't realize what she's doing, and she's probably at her worst when Galt is doing his, 5-page monologue on individualism.
Sure. And money is the root of all good and such.
Yeah.
But I'm interested, science fiction. There's a sci-fi movie from the 1920s called Metropolis that I particularly enjoyed. And it's this kind of like high-tech utopia city where there's these very rich people who exploit these very poor people. And so the poor people are organized around this woman, and there's a robot. Have you ever seen Metropolis with Fritz Lang's film?
I haven't seen it. I'm familiar with it. In fact, I think the design for C-3PO was based on the robot from Metropolis.
That makes sense. And, it's pretty good. And if you look at it, it's very clearly like a Marxist analogy. And one of the weirdest things about the movie Metropolis that I noticed is the way it ends. It clearly wasn't meant to end that way. I get the idea that the censor, stepped in and changed it at the last minute, because the end is very anticlimactic. I don't want to ruin it for anyone who's going to watch it, but I get the idea the ending was supposed to be something a little bit different. It was building up to something, and then all of a sudden it ends in this very like bizarre way. But science fiction was a big part of the 1920s, Weimar Germany. There was the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I believe, which was about brainwashing and hypnosis. But you also have Nosferatu, right? A brown horror film that comes out then. And it seems like in the 20s, when Germany was just this deeply impoverished place, ruined after World War I, you have some really amazing breakthroughs in film. But you also have some amazing breakthroughs over in the USSR. That's the time period. The 20s is when, the USSR, they're starving, they're blockaded, but Sergei Eisenstein is making, the first films to include a montage, the battleship Potemkin, and all of that. It seems like, times of great hardship tend to produce great art. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with that 1,000%. And I think both because, when people are pushed to something, like, you're always going to create a little bit more when you're uncomfortable than when you're comfortable. What was his name? Arthur Miller, one of my absolute favorite writers, and I love that he refused to name names at the House of Un-American Activities Committee. He said about playwrights, and I think this applies not just to playwrights but to all writers in general, that the thing that drives a playwright is there is something within us that we cannot reconcile with the rest of the world. And all of the art that we create is born out of that friction. And I think that really kind of goes down to artists across the board, all the good ones at least. It's not necessarily that you have to suffer to create great art, but usually if you're called to create art, it's because there is some contradiction deep within you driving you to do that, to work out something, to express something, to, you know, and so I would say that kind of got lost there, but
Sure.
what you were talking about bad times make for great art. I think absolutely.
Yeah, well, I feel like a lot of the art that we see that is made by baby boomers is very much some kind of reinterpretation of 1968 to 1972. That was a period of intense turmoil in the United States in the middle of, the Cold War, Vietnam, civil rights, and a lot of, and it's interesting. I see this in politics too. A lot of politics we get from baby boomers is an attempt to reenact that period. And I almost feel like a lot of the art they create is also an attempt to reenact that period. That was the period of the most intense strife they'd ever seen in their lives. And it's almost like so much of the way they view the world is an attempt to kind of recreate that moment or say what we could have done right in those times to make things turned out better. Generals fighting the last war, as is the expression. But like Star Wars, right? I mean, George Lucas is a baby boomer, and he has admitted at this point that there was a Marxist and almost kind of a third worldist influence on Star Wars, right? That the Rebel Alliance was based on the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. People call them the Viet Cong. That's not exactly the correct name. He's admitted that much. He's also apparently said some very interesting things praising the cinema of the Soviet Union and saying that because it wasn't a commercial cinema, even though they were censored in terms of saying anything against the Communist Party or the state, they had more artistic freedom because when you make movies in the United States, the marketers are sitting down with you and you're basically forced to do what the studio thinks is marketable. So how do you see Star Wars in terms of politics? What kind of politics do you read into Star Wars?
Star Wars is really interesting, and I think you're totally right. Princess Leia, her hair is based off of a Mexican revolutionary.
Wow.
Yeah, you can look it up. I don't remember the woman's name, but like literally that two like cinnamon buns on the side. Yeah, there's like a female Mexican revolutionary with like, and in fact she has like two Chewbacca belts of like bullets that she's wearing. So yeah, I think the politics of Star Wars has been really interesting because Star Wars is unique in the fact that I will contend that Star Wars is not science fiction. Star Wars is fantasy in space. And so like
thing, right?
Say what?
Swords and everything.
Yeah, they got swords, they got magic, they've got wizards. It's just space wizards. So it's a kind of a really cool genre mashup, and I think that's one of the reasons why it appeals to so many people. Because the call of our past is so strong with humans because there is very much a feeling that as we've moved into modernity, we've lost something. And I think we definitely have, by the way. We've also gained a lot too. But when you take these, recurring motifs from human history and you project them into the future, there's something really cool and captivating about that. And I really think that's why, like Star Wars, at least the original 3 trilogy, I think it beats Star Trek, like hands down. People are gonna get mad at me for saying that. Like Star Trek has its stuff, but like it's just so compelling in those first 3 movies.
I mean, I've seen the statements that George Lucas has made. When I look at Star Wars, I don't much see Marxism. I just kind of see 1960s counterculture, right? Like, for example, the villains are always militarized. I don't know if the Empire does anything else, but it's just a military. It's just like one big military in space, right? They're wearing military uniforms. It's this military force that's occupying the galaxy. Militarism is the enemy. And then on top of that, you have, the Jedi, which are like this mystical religion with like Jedi masters. And, it's almost kind of like the love for Buddhism or Eastern mysticism you see among a lot of new left activists. And the other thing that I see in Star Wars is the first movie, obviously, Luke is living with his aunt and uncle and they don't understand him. And there's like this, teen rebellion kind of thing going on. And so he runs away from the family who doesn't understand him to go and join the revolution. That sounds like straight out of a 1968, that's totally, flavor of the times. But again, I don't really see it as particularly Marxist. I just kind of see it as 1960s counterculture against the man, against the system, mystical hippie love, not hate. Hate is the power of the enemy. Yeah, I don't quite see Marxism in it. Do you see Marxism in Star Wars?
I mean, I could see a Marxist reading of it. I think there's maybe some ideas that Lucas might have taken from Marxism. But I mean, that's also, again, Lucas was essentially channeling the zeitgeist. He was channeling the spirit of the times, and Marx was a part of the spirit of the times as much as the counterculture was or anything else. Also, Lucas, he tends to, like, he said that he had like episodes 1 through 3 written for years and all this stuff. I think he will, and then there was talk about like how he was trying to base his the prequels on some weird like ring theory of story composition. I think he just finds a couple of ideas and is like, oh, that sounds cool. Yeah, that's what I'm doing, and tells people that, and they just lap it up. I think he's just making up a lot of it. So if he's saying he's basing things on like Marxism, I think he's more or less, he's got some Marxist ideas in there, but I don't think Lucas is like a Marxist. Yeah. Now, he does have some sympathies for the Soviet Union, and you know where you can see it is you can see it in not in Star Wars, but in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Yeah, and that fourth one, which is widely held as the worst Indiana Jones, and I kind of agree with him on that because he survives the fridge in the fridge, the nuclear bomb. But in that, the bad guy who takes the place of the Nazis is a Soviet, but like you can tell that he has much more esteem for the Soviet bad guy than he ever did for any of the Nazi bad guys, which, by the way, is correct and true and 1000%. Like, I hate the lazy equivocation of the Nazis and the Soviets. So, like, I would say Lucas definitely has some Marxist, like, sympathies and definitely some revolutionary and counterculture sympathies, but I don't think he's setting out and, like, putting that into the text directly. I think he's just channeling that as it's part of the spirit of the times and the things that he's influenced by.
Well, in terms of like new left influence on fantasy and science fiction, the work of art that I thought was probably the most influenced by the new left and the 1960s counterculture was Harry Potter. The Harry Potter series, you look at that, I mean, it just, the whole thing reeks of the new left, right? And the evidence is there too, right? J.K. Rowling marched against the Vietnam War, marched for civil rights. Her hero is Jessica Mitford, the Communist Party member and journalist who ran away from home to go fight in Spain and then moved to the United States to become this muckraker journalist who exposed all kinds of wrongdoing. But if you look at Harry Potter, right, so you've got the Dursley family are these uptight working class people that are racist and bigoted and love the death penalty and love corporal punishment and are just these awful caricatures of like middle class awful racist British, I don't know what you want to call it, middle suburban British culture, conservatives, right? So Harry Potter breaks out of that, and the place he finds as his home is a place full of people with long hair and beards who do lots of magic. And then, of course, in the wizarding world, who are the villains? Well, they're a group of people that are racist, are bigoted against people who don't have magic in their blood, who dress in black all the time and are trying to restore the old order. And they have, I believe at one point, they're dressed like the Ku Klux Klan, and they wear, they're the Death Eaters, and they wear hoods over their faces. And then, of course, let's not forget that who are the heroes of the Harry Potter saga? Well, they're all students, and the way that they fight for justice is by breaking the rules and sneaking out at night and sneaking around. And at one point, they form an underground student army, Dumbledore's army. You can almost look at that as like the Weathermen or SDS or something like that. And that it's very much a new left kind of influenced a fairy tale. Now,
which is funny, by the way, because I read Dumbledore's army in retrospect as
and that's like more modern,
Yeah. It's more modern. Yeah, but J.K. Rowling came out against Antifa because she's a liberal.
Well, she came out against Jeremy Corbyn. She's much more conservative, I guess. I get the impression she was more of a leftist in her younger days, based on what she has said about herself. But we don't know. I mean, you never really know. And that especially when people become famous after not being famous for most of their life story gets rewritten by marketing firms to make them appealing. And who knows? Who knows? And, I do know that she's a harsh critic of Jeremy Corbyn and thinks Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic and is kind of all over the place. But if you look at the Harry Potter genre, though, right? I mean, it very much, I think about the house elves when you got Hermione trying to organize the house elves for their rights, and they tell her to go screw herself. Basically, they don't want to be organized. That reeks of, you read about the new communist movement and these these communists who are wealthy college kids get a job in a factory, an auto plant, or a steel mill, and they're trying to sell their coworkers, the Daily Worker, or the communist newspaper, and get them to understand they're being exploited by this big company, and their coworkers just don't want to hear it. That seems to be like the tragedy of trying to build a communist movement during the booming economy of the 1960s and 70s in the United States. So I mean, I see the new left all over it. I think that Harry Potter, though, it has new meaning. It was a little bit ahead of its time because the new right really blossomed after the books had been published, right? Now, there was a little bit of a precursor to it. The British National Party, which was like a white nationalist party in Britain, actually got elected and had seats long before we had any of the stuff going on over here, like years before Charlottesville or anything like that. So Britain, perhaps she could have seen what was coming. But like you said, I guess she came out against Antifa, but it's pretty clear that the villains are racists. There's no question about that. Harry Potter.
The villains are definitely fascists. J.K. Rowling understands that the enemy is fascism. She doesn't understand what fascism is or how it works. She has a vague idea of it, and you can actually see it if you watch The Crimes of Grindelwald. Like Fantastic Beasts, that movie was phenomenal. I actually, like, a lot of people didn't like it. I thought it was excellent. I really, really enjoyed Fantastic Beasts. And then The Crimes of Grindelwald came out. I was very excited to see it. And oh God, it's so bad. It feels like you're watching the movie, and it feels like you're watching a movie and like you're stepping out of the room for every other scene, and then you come back and you're like, hey, what's going on? But you haven't stepped out of the room. So like, but there's a complete and utter, she's trying to build a fascist movement in it, and as the primary antagonists, and like the way she builds the fascist movement is completely incoherent. And I really think it's just because she has a very liberal understanding. There's a certain places her brain just will not go. Right. And sadly it led to what could have been like one of the best series since Harry Potter, kind of just crashing and burning in the second movie.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Star Trek before. And it's interesting because many people look at Star Trek and see the kind of universe in Star Trek as almost a communist space future. Subtly put, do you see Star Trek as left wing?
Oh, yeah, 1000% left wing. I mean, as left wing as any like capitalist TV show can be. Star Trek was pushing very, like, the original 60s Star Trek, like they had the first interracial kiss on television. Wow. They had a plot line directly about racism where it was two aliens and like they hated each other and wanted to kill each other, and it was because one alien, they both had a face that was split down the middle, and on one side was white and one side was black, and the other alien had the same face split down the middle, but the black and white were reversed, and that's why they want to genocide each other. So no, that's, and they even talk about like a post-scarcity future, the famous quote from Jean-Luc Picard, in that like they've given up basically chasing money, like money no longer plays a role in their lives, and it makes sense. They have replicators that can make absolutely whatever they want. So they do have this sort of post-scarcity space communist future. I think that's something that's really clear to anybody that pays close attention to Star Trek and politics.
Right. I get the impression that it's like, you have the Vulcans that are all about logic, right? And then you have the Romulans that are like the evil Vulcans, and you got the Klingon, which are like supposed to be some kind of ancient warrior culture. something like that. And they're playing with different themes if you look at it. One thing that I found amusing was there was an internet hoax a few years back, many years back, claiming that Gene Roddenberry had been a Marxist. It was debunked. It was not true. It was an internet hoax. And, before he did Star Trek, he did like Dragnet and like police shows, and he was definitely not a Marxist. But they pointed out that there is a Marxist group from Argentina called the what are they called? The Posadists. Yeah, the Posadists.
Oh, I've heard of these people.
Right, and that their narrative about UFOs and Trotskyism matches the plot of the Star Trek movies. Right? They argued that nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable. But at that moment, the UFOs would land to prevent the nuclear war, and that UFOs were evidence that socialism clearly existed on other planets, because only socialism could invent this kind of technology. And they've become kind of a meme that people like to make Trotskyism with, the Star Trek UFO Trotskyist. But apparently they were in Cuba at one point, right, getting training. And they actually started attacking foreign embassies in Cuba, hoping to bring on the nuclear war that was a central part of their ideology, to the point that Fidel Castro imprisoned some of them. So these folks really believed in what they were alleging, interestingly. And in a way, it's kind of sad. From what I understand, the leader of the group had been tortured under one of the military regimes in Argentina and had probably lost his mind, but was very charismatic and came out of prison with these revelations about the UFOs. So it's sad in a way, but it's kind of amusing. But there is no connection to the Star Trek series. That was purely an internet hoax that was going around. Gene Roddenberry had no connection to any leftist groups, from what we understand. But I do think that's amusing. Do you have any other thoughts on Star Trek and politics?
I mean, Star Trek, it's what's been very interesting with Star Trek is to watch how when various productions of it are actually made and what they are, like the environment they're made in. For instance, you look at the Star Trek II and like the early Star Trek movies, the Klingons are clearly the USSR. Like they're really heavily coding the Klingons as Russian because they're the enemies. And then, you go to, the J.J. Abrams Star Treks, and suddenly like the enemies, like the Klingons are now being like coded like Arabs. So Star Trek, it straddles a very interesting line between being a capitalist product, entertainment product, between being art and then also like being a vision of the future and a moral guide for where we should be going with our society now. I think Star Trek Into Darkness, for instance, can really be read as a rejection of like kind of 9/11 paranoia and the Patriot Act and an attempt to return the country's soul to what it was perceived to have been before 9/11 drove us all crazy.
Wow. Well, science fiction, I would maintain that the concept of science fiction is more left-wing. The concept of fantasy is more conservative. But, some sci-fi is really right-wing. Let's be real about that. Heinlein, Robert Heinlein. Have you read that kind of stuff? Starship Troopers? You want to talk about that some?
Yeah, I've read a little bit of Heinlein. Heinlein is, I'm really interested because I've read the Cliff Notes on Stranger in a Strange Land, and I really want to read it because it sounds batshit insane, but also like really fun. But like, there's actually a great essay, I'd sent it to you, by Michael Moorcock, who is a fantasy author, and he wrote a number of like radical left-wing critiques of literature. And the essay that I sent you was Starship Stormtroopers, that he was talking about how Heinlein, is essentially reactionary and fascist. And even like the movie Starship Troopers is it is a leftist satire of Heinlein's work. Like it's an adaptation, but it's an adaptation that exists specifically to make fascists look silly. But then also because you oppose law and you can't tell the difference between someone making fun of something and a genuine a genuine person who's nuts about it. Fascists then went on to unironically be like, yeah, no, I absolutely need to do Starship Troopers. We need to, make sure that only soldiers can be citizens and that kind of stuff. And our racialized enemies actually are the equivalent of giant alien bugs. Again, it's like when you're creating fiction, be it science fiction, fantasy, horror, whatever, again, you're taking the world as you experience it as an individual, and you are filtering it through yourself to tell a story that, whether you intend to or not, will have some element of truth in how you see the world in particular. An example where a very bad thing goes very good is, like, for instance, H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft was a monster as far as racism, and like, if he had lived today, he would have been like on the alt-right posting paypays like nothing. But his racism and his xenophobia and his fear of sex all fed into this really great thing that created the whole genre of cosmic horror. And so, you kind of saw his personal failings wind up creating, being transliterated through his genius, and creating like an entire genre and an entire universe for writers to write in and scare people with. But, there was a joke I saw on like Chapo Trap House where they want to do a sketch where H.P. Lovecraft shows up with his new story, and it's just like all the things are like Italians and Romanians and this, and like there's an editor like going, let's change this to the fish folk of Innsmouth. We're just it covers up all the racial slurs with like just a monster.
When you talk about about science fiction and H.P. Lovecraft, it brings up something that I've often felt, which is I have a love for pulp, right? I mean, if you look at Edgar Rice Burroughs, there's no question that the Tarzan series is not high art, right? It's like people aren't it's not like a pivotal work of human civilization, but it's a fun story. And a lot of sci-fi is like that. A lot of, and it seems like, nowadays with movies, with television, it doesn't so much exist. But at one point there was a high demand for kind of low quality, pulp fiction, that you would call it, whether it be sci-fi, fantasy. Often it was very titillating in a sexual way, had a lot of action. And you see, a whole genre of that, like the Kull the Conqueror and right, Conan the Barbarian comes out of that. Tarzan comes out of that. A lot of this stuff was out there, and it was kind of, it gave a livelihood to a lot of writers who nowadays would probably have an ordinary job and just do like fan fiction online, because they wouldn't be able to support themselves. But I mean, it seems like people did get by writing this kind of pulp, and there was just an audience for science fiction, and there were like magazines, Science Fiction Quarterly, and it would just be short stories and stuff like that. And that's something people don't quite grasp. And this even applied to movies. There used to be a lot more movies made, right? Nowadays, we know about the big studios in Hollywood. We see foreign films occasionally, but there used to be a lot more just kind of run-of-the-mill, low budget sci-fi, horror, fantasy, action movies that got made that people saw, but they paid less than they paid for other movies, right? I mean, can you talk about pulp? Because I find that some of this pulp from the 50s and 60s is actually very enjoyable. They tend to have a little bit more artistic freedom, and how the movie is going to end, and you kind of know the tropes of the plot, but because of that, you can kind of have more fun along the way, right? It doesn't take itself too seriously. You can say that I just watched Flash Gordon for the first time. That movie doesn't take itself very seriously, and because of that, it's fun. I think about there was the Hercules series with Kevin Sorbo, and then Xena with Lucy Lawless, and those were filmed in New Zealand, very low budget, but they knew what they were doing. They didn't take themselves too seriously, so the writers could have a lot of fun. And you can tell that the actors are probably having a lot of fun, and it's fun in a way that it doesn't kind of ruin itself by making itself out to be, Hamlet or Shakespeare or defining art for civilization. Can you talk about pulp?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to point something out, actually, because you mentioned Flash Gordon. The reason Star Wars exists is Flash Gordon. And in fact, George Lucas wanted to do a Flash Gordon movie and couldn't get the rights, so he wrote Star Wars. Yeah, Flash. There is a direct line from like that type of pulp straight up into Star Wars, and Star Wars you could argue is high art in the fact that it's shaped generations and will be enjoyed for centuries, probably as long as those films can be seen. Now, I did want to also point out really quickly, so high art and low art, and you gave me a great example to talk about this because we were watching the streamer Destiny debated, what was that guy, Eric Stryker? Mm-hmm. And he went after him on music. Now, Destiny destroyed him on music in particular, sure. But what really shocked me was when he was like, the working class can't afford tickets to the symphony. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because I have worked in ticket sales for symphonies. I worked for Carnegie Hall. I worked for all of these like really big arts institutions. I sold ballet for like freaking 5 years. The working class can get to these. They absolutely can, even in the United States, because arts organizations are nonprofits, and though the tickets are expensive and it's seen as a high society thing to do, there are easily ways that anybody can see these performances. The thing is that Eric Stryker just didn't have any concept of it and just kind of was using it as something to throw out there. Like, we don't have high art anymore. We have this bullshit pulp.
When I heard that, and I am a big advocate for classical music, I'm a big critic of our music, but I could tell he didn't even really know what he was talking about. He was trying to sound like a stodgy old conservative. It's a racist meme. Back in the 1950s, the kids are listening to rock and roll. Why aren't you listening to Beethoven and Mozart? That's, that's just, It's like he hadn't even really thought out what his critique of popular music, why he liked classical music. He was just putting out an old racist meme. And he didn't really have much to back it up with. And what I thought was interesting is that Wagner, he likes, right? Being a Nazi, he likes Wagner, right? Well, the thing is, though, the critique that I would have of mainstream music is the same critique I would have of Wagner. I love Wagner music, by the way.
Mm-hmm. I really do too.
But it's emotional manipulation. Right? He's manipulating your emotions from beginning to end, right? He's not appealing to the part of your brain that is, reason based and all of that. It's like rock and roll. It's just intense emotions. It's like Stairway to Heaven or something, right? And that emotions unchained and without kind of an intellectual basis can be somewhat dangerous. And that's where you're approaching pornography. And departing art in some ways, but I'm okay with doing it. But you have to understand what you're doing, and I think a lot of our art and media nowadays, especially like the commercials and the advertising we're surrounded with, is emotionally manipulating us in one way or another, and we're not even conscious that it's going on. Everyone who goes to a Wagner concert knows what they're in for, right? Everyone who goes to a rock concert knows what they're in for. But if you're just riding the subway one day and there's an ad on the wall, you don't know that your emotions are being played with. Your insecurities are being played on. You're being made to feel more fearful, perhaps, or maybe more joyful, perhaps. I mean, it's and that emotional manipulation is one, lacking in intellectual content, and two, it can have a lasting impact on the person's subconscious. They might not be aware of. You might listen to Wagner one day and 2 days later feel a certain way. It has a big impact on your mood and your emotions, whether you realize it or not. And but he doesn't apply it fairly, right? He doesn't like rap music. He doesn't like rock and roll, but he loves Wagner, and it's not a well thought out critique. It's just kind of and I have been critical of the left. And in my conversation with Jyoti Brar, the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, I actually had a conversation with her because she is a music, she has a degree in music. She studied music. She's a classical musician all her life. But in communist circles, there's this feeling that classical music is immoral somehow, that it's white music, it's Eurocentric, people who listen to it stuck up. And I can tell you, I don't want to name names, but at one point I was just raked over the coals for putting classical music in a political video one time because apparently that's racist. You know what I mean?
You got some woke scold going after you with that bull crap.
Right. No, but at the same time, though, That's not the feeling in the socialist countries. And in fact, the Soviet Union was all about classical music. Classical music was widely available. And actually, one of the amazing experiences I had as a communist was attending the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador in 2013. And the highlight of the festival was the North Korean choir. And the North Korean choir performed Italian opera, they performed Beethoven, they performed Mozart, they performed traditional Latin American music like Guantanamera and The People United Will Never Be Defeated. They were amazing, but they were all about classical music. So the way we view things, the left in the West and the left in the developing world, it's all really, really complicated. We can all agree that Eric Stryker is a fool. But beyond that, when it comes to music, I think it's way more complicated than people think. But you have a
Absolutely.
lot you want to say, so please go ahead.
Yeah, that's good, because there was a point I wanted to make, but I wanted to go back to the pulp versus the low art versus high art. Yeah, so the thing is that low art and high art, it's all in what the upper class views as low art and high art. It's really not like Shakespeare was creating low art in his day. They had at the Globe, they had the groundlings, they had people come in and throw stuff at the stage and yell at the original Shakespeare plays were like 3 to 5 hours long, and it was because people would just come and go, get their lunch, come back, oh, the play's still going on. It was low art. Now, it was low art that was oftentimes commissioned by the Crown at times, but it was as much like popular entertainment as rap or Marvel movies or whatever. What changed where it became high art was as opera, same thing, low art when it was created. Opera then became the highest of the high art and the most inaccessible and the snootiest art that you could get, because eventually, the upper class catches on, and then they start to do it so that it's a ritual that they go through. You go out to the ballet. Some people go out to the ballet because they're nerds and they love the dancers and they love seeing the things. Other people go out to the ballet because, they think it's a great way to have a date. Some people go out to the ballet because it is a status symbol and it is a ritual I do this because this is what a wealthy, cultured, intelligent person does. In 100 years, maybe the Marvel movies, that's the thing that the hoity-toity people do, and the kids are doing whatever, they're running around in a hologram video game or something. So I really think that the distinction between high art and low art is cultural. And I would also say, like with Wagner, so there's two things that you're touching on there when you're talking about engaging intellectually and engaging emotionally. And it's essentially like there's two basic, and I may get the terms wrong here, but it's the neoclassical and the romantics. So the romantic movement in the arts, and I fall more heavily on the romantic side, tends to be people who are more interested in exploring emotions, exploring moments of awe, the natural world, the past. They tend to be skeptical of progress, not necessarily right-wing, but there are a lot of romantic reactionaries. I'm more or less on the left, but I'm heavily romantic in the works that I enjoy and like just my own personal philosophy about everything. And then you have the neoclassical, which is more the structured, the kind of classical music, the rationality over instinct. So these are two competing drives in human society and two competing artistic movements. And one is not necessarily better than the other. But I will agree you can go off the deep end with them. Wagner, interestingly enough, his Ring cycle directly inspired Lord of the Rings. Gollum, there's a Gollum character in Wagner's Ring cycle. The whole thing involves the theft of magical gold that corrupts its user. There's a dragon, and yeah. So Wagner, I can see how people might be being emotionally manipulated by Wagner or by artists. And yeah, you can be emotionally manipulated by art, but that's another way of saying art touched you. It spoke to you. And that would be the difference between that and, say, advertising and propaganda, where you are actually being cynically manipulated and no one's actually sharing anything true with you as you go through and you see the ads on the subway. So I think I hope I answered your question there. Did I leave anything unsaid?
No, what came to my mind is I recall when I was, sitting in the audience at the Met, watching the opening of Gotterdammerung with my wife, and the curtains came up, and of course the opening scene is the I don't what are they the people that are weaving the fabric of time, and they're
The
having a
Norns.
yeah, and they're singing to each other and explaining the whole backstory, and for whatever reason, I can't tell you exactly why. And as I was watching it and I was listening to the music, which is like this anticipation of this exciting story is about to start, this was the opening of the Star Wars movie. When the text is coming up, the Rebel Alliance, and you're like anticipating a big story, and they're explaining the backstory, and you're like, wow, and they're weaving this. I don't know. I just saw that as very much fantasy, art, and culture. These things build on each other, no doubt. I guess before we conclude, though, I did want to talk with you more about some specific art. For example, when you talk about fantasy, right? And there is one particular theme that I see in a lot of not very popular fantasy novels, and the story goes like this. It's that so-and-so is the prince or so-and-so is the princess, but they have somehow lost their place and are stuck being a peasant. And they spend the entire story attempting to regain their throne, right? And and I find that to be an odd way to insert kind of a Randian libertarian motif into a time of feudalism when there was absolutely no social mobility. And I also find it to be kind of a narcissistic fantasy that a lot of people have. I think a lot of people that are very, very narcissistic have this illusion that somehow, well, they are far more important than they actually are, and everyone around them doesn't understand it, but one day they will do something great to get everyone else around them to understand how important they actually are. I see that as a particularly problematic theme that I see in a lot of fantasy fiction. Have you noticed this theme?
Oh, I definitely have. And you'll notice that there are a lot of fascists who are very interested in that particular theme.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Augustus Sol Invictus. Like if you read he talks about how he was born for a great war, and if one didn't happen, he would start it. Yeah, that's painful narcissism. You see similar stuff like with the Golden One. I'm not going to say that like the restoration of the monarchy, that is a trope that you see, the restoration of the proper monarchy. I mean, that's in everything from like Game of Thrones to freaking The Lion King, and in a way Hamlet, though obviously Hamlet does not win with the restoration of the monarchy because Hamlet and almost everyone dies at the end, which makes it, by the way, a superior story, a superior way to tell that story. But yeah, there's this idea that here's the thing. I think that, and this gets into my own personal philosophy, I think all people are way more important than we realize and than that society tells us. But similarly, it's everyone. It's literally everyone. And there are people that think that the importance, the protagonist role needs to go to them, and they need to be more important than other people, as opposed to being important in their own specific way, and being exceptional. And so like oftentimes they will want to do this really big thing. It can lead to a very toxic kind of false idea where a person tries to gain self-actualization at the expense of others. And I think that is a trap that can be found like within the fantasy genre, but also any genre of fiction and any kind of like, I guess, hyper individualism. You can find that where it's, I am important, but I'm also so much more important than thou, if that makes sense.
Indeed. I think we've all met people who really exude such feelings, and they aren't pleasant to be around. I mean, if you look at the Chronicles of Narnia, right? That's a fantasy series, and it's very much. It's very much. I can't remember his name, the author of it.
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, a Christian theologian, preaching. I mean, it very much is. And it has all of the tropes that people almost criticize a lot of old British fiction for, a lot of old British fiction that like predates him. They see it as preachy, moralizing. A good little schoolboy will save the world by being so good and loyal and following all the rules. And people see it as kind of just incarnating. And in some places, you read some of the stories, like The Last Battle, and some of it where it's almost comical to the degree he's fulfilling that stereotype of stodgy, moralizing, lecturing British fiction. Do you see it that way?
I think C.S. Lewis, there's a lot to his work, and I think it's one of the reasons why it endures to this day and why it has so many fans. Are his religious metaphors extremely heavy-handed? Yeah. And that's actually why I think, J.R.R. Tolkien is a superior writer to C.S. Lewis. Both of them were essentially writing. Tolkien was a writer and a Christian whose Christianity influenced his writing, as opposed to C.S. Lewis, who went more in the explicit thing where he was a Christian first and a writer and artist second. And I think that, I'm working on a fantasy novel right now that deals with a lot of religious ideas, some Christian, some Buddhist, some Hindu, and a lot of stuff is being put into that. But what I'm putting forth beyond my own ideology and those are the people that I'm working with, what's more important than that is that we tell a true story that resonates with people, that says something important about the human condition and our relationship with our past, our future, our gods, and ourselves. And I feel like that's where C.S. Lewis is failing, is because he instructs as opposed to reveals, if that makes sense. And an audience can instinctively sense falseness. They can sense when their emotions are being played with. And I think too often with C.S. Lewis, he is saying what he thinks. He's not really expressing his soul as much as he is saying the things that he believes are right because someone else told them they're right, if that makes sense.
Right. Thomas Carlyle, who is the author of Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History, which I think is a very powerful book. It's like lectures he gave in like the 1800s in Scotland. He talks about how, for some kind of mass religious movement to catch on, obviously it contains a grain of truth in it, and to just dismiss some religion that is not your own, it wouldn't have such a mass following and exude such mass fanaticism among people if it didn't have some real powerful truths within it. And I think you can say the same for fiction. For a story to really catch on, it has to have some real truth in it that really speaks to people. And it can have its flaws, but it has to really speak to something more than itself. It can't just be kind of good entertainment. It has to, for it to really kind of take root the way some of these sci-fi and fantasy genres have. They obviously have to be saying something a lot more than just, entertaining the audience.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because one of so Greg Cotis, who is a writer that I know, he wrote Urinetown. And he is he's excellent writer. He was also in my karate class, so I've physically fought him before. But anyway, Greg, I once had him, we left the dojo and I was like, can I just buy you a beer and pick your brain about being an artist? Because every time I meet a successful artist, I always kind of just try to sit down with them and be like, how do you do it? Tell me how to do it. And one of the things that I've realized is that in a lot of ways, artists can't really 100% express how we do it, because part of creating great art is you get to the end of that movie and you're like, oh my God, that was so good. How in the world did that happen? It's like a magic trick. And a lot of us, because it's so subconscious, we're not even 100% aware of it. We just let it flow. And what Greg told me was that American culture has a linguistic and that they have a problem with the concept of someone as a genius, as in like a Steve Jobs is a genius. Whereas the way Greg saw it was that a genius is not something that you are. a genius is something you have. A person has a genius. And so the key to creating great art, and I would say doing anything great really, is if you find you've got a genius whispering to you, is to listen to it and to follow that. Because again, like think of it more in the sense of like the Greek Greek muse, and when Homer opens the Odyssey and the Iliad, the first thing he's doing is he invokes the muse to sing to him and to transmit this story, these truths through him. It's not him doing it entirely. He's more or less the vessel. And if you think of yourself as an artist, as a vessel for a muse, as a vessel for genius to flow through you, as opposed to the originator of that, I think you're much more likely to create great art.
Wow. Well, on that note, I think we can conclude. This was a great discussion. I certainly learned a lot. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Folks, check out the Snow White Zombie Apocalypse. Great hit. The comic shop near you. And I'm sure we'll be talking to Brent again soon because it's always a great conversation. Thank you, Brent.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can, check out my YouTube channel. I just started, if you can, like, link it or something. I just started doing it and dipping my toe in. You can see me talking about politics, art, and just whatever else. So keep an eye on it. It's a fun thing. My most recent one I did was a video on Proudhon and private property and why rent is theft.
Thank you very much.